Okay, today we're going to be looking at the firebombing of Japan. So this is in your note packet on the bottom of page 10. So this started March 9, 1945, and so we're going to look at that. So the man we're looking at right here is Curtis LeMay. He was the man in charge of the B-29 bombing missions in 1945, and so the bomber base in the Mariana Islands that was sending the B-29s to attack Japan, and his mission, as we'll hear, was to win at all costs. And he had a very, how to describe it, a very I don't want to say practical. He looked at the Japanese and how they were fighting and acknowledged that people were going to die. If we didn't bomb Japan, people would die. If we bombed Japan, people were going to die. Because looking at how the Japanese fought on Iwo Jima, we've been studying that very, very much in detail. How the Japanese fought at Saipan. Remember, that's where the civilians themselves were told to commit suicide, and so they jumped off cliffs and blew themselves up with grenades and cut themselves open and drowned their kids, and thousands of them. And we just saw how they defended places like Peleliu and the Battle of Manila, and this convinced us that we were going to lose tens of thousands of men, forcing Japan to end the war. And so this man's goal was to shorten the war by destroying Japan with bombs rather than going in there with armies and the Marines. So I'll read you a quote. This is from Major General Graves Erskine of the Marine Corps, thinking about Japan. The estimate was that it was going to cost us 1 million American casualties, that's dead and wounded, to invade Japan. He says, victory is not in doubt. What is in doubt in all of our minds was whether there will be any of us left to dedicate our cemetery at the end, or whether the last Marine will die knocking out the last Japanese gun and gunner. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you some videos of the firebombing of Japan.
Conventional bombs demand pinpoint accuracy. But targeting by sight is tricky. Americans often drop several bombs and hope one hits the mark. During the Battle of Tinian, officers gather on Saipan to watch this film. It shows the field testing of a new type of weapon. It's called Napalm. A combustible mixture of sticky gel and fuel, designed to spread and burn. Americans have no problem using fire. It's already pouring out of flamethrowers and tanks. But this is a whole new level of destruction. Now, an airplane can become a dragon. With one breath, it can set a bridge ablaze, set water on fire, or turn a field of green earth into a lifeless, charred dead zone where no one can hide. After watching this film, the brass on Saipan don't hesitate. They ordered 8,500 pounds of it. Inside of a year, America's use of napalm in the Pacific is spread like wildfire.
Okay, so you get the idea there. So we'll shift to just what are our bombs actually, or how are they made?
The main component of the M69 bomb, a cheesecloth sock containing specially processed jellied gasoline. When ignited, the gel filling becomes a clinging fiery mass spreading more than a yard in diameter. It burns at approximately 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 to 10 minutes. The bomb was developed by the National Defense Research Council in collaboration with the Chemical Warfare Service. In a demonstration, it is fired electrically from the ground against a wall. For airdrops, the M69 is assembled in groups of 38. The E-23 adapter is used in forming 500-pound aimable clusters carried by planes equipped to handle this size bomb. On the assembly line at Mays Landing, New Jersey, the bombs are secured inside the cylindrical halves of the cluster wall. The bomb is held together by 9 steel straps attached to release buckles, which are broken open by time fuses within the fin assembly.
Right, so you see how this is made, right? You got all these incendiary bombs that are all packed together into a big shell so it can be dropped. And then when it's dropped, a fuse goes off and all these bombs separate and hit their target.
The clusters are given high and low altitude tests at Edgewood Arsenal with a B-25 loading the 500-pounders.
Right, so that gives you an idea there. Now more about their usage.
Could now deliver fire on an unprecedented scale.
Fire could destroy them. So using incendiary bombs, you could take out and wipe out large areas with very little effort.
During World War II, both the Allied and Axis powers discovered that fire was the simplest, most effective way to bring an enemy to its knees. At the start of the war, the U.S. Army Air Force had attempted to use precision bombing raids to take out specific military and industrial targets. By dropping high explosive ordnance on their enemies' nerve centers, they had hoped to render them powerless. But the strategy had problems.
In the American Air Force, they have a thing called the Northern Bomb Sight, and you could hit the bottom of a pickle barrel at 22,000 feet. The problem is, they tested that in Arizona. It's very clear in Arizona. In Europe, most of the time, you don't get the weather to use the North Bomb Sight.
Flying at 20,000 feet in poor weather conditions made it difficult to put bombs on target. To make an accurate hit, raids had to be carried out in broad daylight, and that proved almost suicidal.
The problem is that it took a lot of bombers, a lot of sorties, and a lot of dead American airmen to try to carry that out. So it was a difficult process. The alternative was nighttime bombing and to do area bombing. It was less precise. It was aimed at urban centers. If you happen to get industrial targets, all the better. And it was designed to terrify the citizenry.
Bombing at night was safer, but rendered targeting systems useless. The Germans came up with a solution. They began to develop small cluster incendiary bomblets that would burn vigorously, causing mass destruction without the need for accurate targeting.
This is a German 1 kilogram magnesium bomblet from an incendiary bomb. There would be about 260 of these bundled together. They'd disperse in the air and fall over a large target area. They would have been filled with magnesium, which would have ignited the thermite, which would then burn at an intense temperature.
During the autumn of 1940, Germany launched a sustained firebombing campaign over London. More than 1 million incendiary bombs were dropped in the first 2 months, destroying over 1 million buildings. The US and British military retaliated and began to fight fire with fire.
This bomb, it was dropped over Calais in 1940. The British recovered it and then sent it to the United States so that the US military could study it. And the Americans came up with their own magnesium cluster bomb. This shape was so that you could bundle hundreds of these together and drop them over a target. And actually would also have a fin assembly so it wouldn't just tumble in the air, but also maybe drop a little bit more accurately.
On impact, a spring-loaded fuse ignited the magnesium, which in turn lit the thermite mixture, creating scorching, melting fire. The Allies began experimenting with other incendiary materials to destroy man and machine. The result, white phosphorus.
White phosphorus is a very simple chemical. It's just good old phosphorus, but once it gets burning, it doesn't stop. It was initially used to create a thick white smoke on the battlefield. But if you happen to get a fragment of that white phosphorus on anything, a piece of wood, a piece of grass, or a piece of human being, it keeps burning and doesn't stop. If you've got a piece of white phosphorus burning its way into your buddy's flesh, the only way to save your buddy is to take your bayonet and carve that piece of phosphorus out of his body. And you've got to do it right away before it kills him.
Laden with white phosphorus and thermite bombs, the US and British Air Forces began torching German cities. On February 15, 1945, British and American Air Forces attacked Dresden. First, dropping regular explosives to blow the roofs off, the Allied planes rained down 2,000 pounds of incendiary bombs on the city. Within hours, Dresden was engulfed in a raging firestorm.
A firestorm is a fire that is burning completely out of control, that is feeding on itself, that is creating such an incredible updraft in the center of the fire that it's causing the fire to spread further and further across the city.
A firestorm is created as the heat from the original fire draws in the surrounding air. This creates an updraft and causes the inflowing winds to change direction erratically, spreading the fire and feeding its force. As temperatures reached 2,700 degrees, over 50% of Dresden was destroyed, with around 40,000 casualties. Fire had revealed its awesome destructive capabilities. But moved forward just a few weeks, and the flames had risen to new heights as fire hit Japan's capital.
Entire cities are consumed not just by the incendiary bombs themselves, but by their very own building materials. Tokyo, for instance, largely a wooden city, made itself into its own funeral pyre when it was set alight by American incendiary bombs.
In July 1944, Major General Curtis LeMay was placed in control of the 21st Bomber Command and given the job of winning the Pacific War at all costs. Earning the nickname Bombs Away LeMay, he believed that carpet firebombing was the answer.
LeMay's marching orders: win the victory in Japan at all costs. And he did.
Starting in March 1945, LeMay began to rain down a torrent of fire on Tokyo and other Japanese cities. 6,960 B-29 sorties were flown over Japan, dropping a total bomb load of 41,592 tons. Tokyo suffered the worst. In one raid, over 150,000 Japanese civilians were killed or wounded, and 16 square miles of the city was destroyed.
What happened was the bombers were flying down a line, and they would drop their incendiaries down a line, and they got a line of fire going, and the wind was very strong that night. So there was this sweeping effect across the area, and there were more people killed in that raid than there were in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
As incendiary bombing created towering infernos across the globe, both Allied and Axis powers experimented with ways to deliver mass flaming carnage. The Japanese manufactured balloon bombs, hoping they'd be blown across the Pacific by wind currents and set the U.S. on fire.
The Japanese scientists came up with an idea of putting up a bunch of helium-filled balloons with little bombs on them, and they floated them across the Pacific to blow up pieces of the United States. And some of them actually got as far as California, and some of them even got to Nevada.
The balloon bombs were 30 feet in diameter, filled with 19,000 cubic feet of hydrogen. Each balloon had 30 pounds of incendiary material suspended beneath it. 300 of the 9,000 Japanese balloons landed in the U.S. The American government were so afraid the bombs would affect morale that they kept it secret, and the Japanese stopped the campaign, believing that the mission had failed completely. While the Japanese experimented with fire balloons to create mass destruction, the U.S. were developing their own secret weapon, the bat bomb. Louis Pfizer, the inventor of napalm, began working on the possibility of an incendiary carrying bat.
Pfizer came up with another idea in which he would load bats up with incendiary devices and drop them over Japan, and they would fly down and roost in Japanese homes and burn up Japan.
Unfortunately, the bats didn't play ball. $2 million later, the project was folded.
The big problem with the flaming bat is that a bat with an incendiary device can go pretty much anywhere. And there were a lot of accidents during development with flaming bats burning barns down all over the countryside in California. The bat burning research was abandoned when it was discovered that a nuclear bomb could actually deliver the flaming Japanese city concept way better than bats could.
In the 20th century, incendiary weapons have caused apocalyptic destruction, reducing men, machines, and entire cities to ash and vapor. The effects of flamethrowers, napalm, and thermite bombs were terrifying.
Okay, and then one more. This is looking at, from a survivor's perspective.
It's March the 9th, 1945, and on the Pacific island of Tinian, more than 300 B-29 bombers are taking off, heading northwest.
B-29s. Their noses point towards Japan.
Just after midnight, they reach their target.
Bombs for Tokyo.
Thousands of feet below, 8-year-old Haruyo Nihei ran for her life as the firestorm spread.
Parents were running from the flames carrying babies on their backs, and other children running beside them. I saw the babies on their backs catching fire. The mothers were going insane. Soon, the parents and the other children were covered in flames too. Everyone was burning.
In this tiny private museum, one of the M69 bombs, incendiaries designed specifically to set Japan's wooden houses alight.
The city burned until 5 a.m. By then, everything had been consumed. I was dragged out. I looked down where I had been lying. At least 10 people had been lying on top of me. All of them were dead, charred, and blackened. I was saved by the people who died.
At the back of this little-known shrine, hidden from public view, I'm allowed in to see this, the urns of the dead. It is very strange to walk among the ashes of 105,000 people. It was the single deadliest night of bombing in history, and yet most Japanese people these days don't even know that these urns are stored here. Around the world, the bombing has been all but forgotten. Even here in Japan, it is barely commemorated. 10-year-old Kisako Motoki was also running that night. At dawn, she arrived at this bridge.
When I got to this bridge, it was blocked by a huge pile of burnt and blackened bodies. So many, I couldn't cross the bridge. I just stood there, frozen. I looked in the river. The water was covered with bodies too.
The firestorm killed both her parents and her brother. Kisako is still angry.
Maybe our government doesn't want to upset the Americans. The bombing was indiscriminate. It killed over 100,000 people, but until now, no investigation has been done. This is a strange country.
US Air Force General Curtis LeMay said if America had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal for what he did to Tokyo. But today, just 70 years on, what happened here has been all but erased from history.
Interesting, they end with a picture of Iwo Jima. Not sure what that has to do with the bombing of Tokyo. So, a lot to process there. We saw the bombing of Dresden in Germany, killed tens of thousands. And you see that the Germans bombed London. And as I mentioned at the beginning, part of our reasoning for dropping the bombs on Japan was because we wanted to end the war, and we were predicting, 1 million casualties. That was the number. We knew the Japanese would fight fanatically to guard their homeland. We knew they were equipping civilians to fight against the American forces, and we anticipated that the Japanese would lose a lot of people. And so it's really a difficult, complex thing to try to understand the firebombing. I don't like the one camp that says we killed innocent civilians, including the old, the young, and they all died horrific deaths. I mean, they think that this firestorm in Tokyo, which was kind of a perfect storm of events, where we had all these fire bombs and the wind was 30 knots, and it created this kind of unique situation where the fire could spread and burn for hours. They think the temperatures got up to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, destroyed 15 square miles of Tokyo. It superheated the canals, so people were diving in the water, as you kind of heard in the video, and they were dying. They dived into the water to try to get away from the fire, but the fire was so hot it superheated the top of the water, so that was no protection. People died in the water, and you could see that napalm burns on top of water too. One pilot said, "This blaze will haunt me forever," and others talked about they were only flying 500 feet up, not thousands of feet up like normal, so they could smell burning flesh, and it was nauseating and really horrific. And so, yes, some people say like this never should have been done. The Americans never should have done this. But I think it's very difficult for us to properly understand the decision to do the firebombing, considering we're here 70 plus years later, and we're not in the midst of a dreadful world war where thousands of Americans are dying from kamikazes, from all kinds of horrific things. The Germans are shooting V2 rockets into London, and it just looks like this war is just going to keep going and going. And we're not the Marines who fought on Iwo Jima or other places in the Pacific. It's one thing if you went into Iwo Jima and you had not fought a battle before, and then you went through over 30 days of fighting. But then can you imagine if you had fought on Iwo Jima and survived it and watched your buddies die, kind of like an Ira Hayes situation where you're suffering from PTSD, and then you're asked to go invade the mainland, like Honshu, the island of where Tokyo's on, in Japan, and have to go through all that emotional death of fighting in a horrible war and seeing things you can never unsee. So I try to understand what happened, and I try to empathize with the misery of the Japanese people, like these people that were interviewed at the end. I also try to understand the American perspective of we want to end this war. And Curtis LeMay firmly believed that by killing people in these fire bombings, he was saving people, specifically Americans who wouldn't have to invade, and Japanese civilians who were told to commit ritualistic suicide after fighting the Americans. Like, if it was either die fighting or commit suicide. And so he argued we saved lives by killing tens of thousands of people. So a lot to think about, a lot to process, but that's the firebombing. So if you just to review to end, so why did we firebomb Japan? Looking at the notes, we firebombed Japan because we were trying to end the war as soon as we could, and we were trying to destroy their industry. And traditional bombing had not been that effective. And so a lot of the Japanese industry was in small houses and places, not huge factories. It was spread out. And so we had to hit their cities to try to destroy their industry and production. So that's the why. The results, we killed well over 100,000 people. In that one raid alone, we continued to bomb their cities, but a lot of evacuation happened. But we did severely impact the Japanese ability to fight the war, and but they still didn't surrender. So, and that's why we ended up using the atomic bombs later that year.